On April 15, 1912, roughly 1,500 people died in the North Atlantic when the Titanic sank beneath water just a few degrees above freezing. Most of us know the story of the sinking. Almost nobody talks about what came next. The desperate, grim, and deeply unfair process of recovering those bodies would reshape the funeral industry for the next century and lay the groundwork for modern disaster victim identification. The clock started ticking immediately. The very next evening, April 16th, the White Star Line's Halifax agents chartered a ship called the CS Mackay-Bennett. This was not a vessel designed for recovering the dead. Its normal job was laying and repairing transatlantic telegraph cables, but within hours it was transformed into what history would remember as a floating morgue. Before the Mackay-Bennett departed Halifax on April 17th, it was loaded with 125 rough-hewn coffins, 100 tons of ice, and every last drop of embalming fluid in the entire city, enough to embalm roughly 70 bodies. The crew were paid double their normal wages. Aboard that ship were John R. Snow, Jr., chief embalmer from the most prominent funeral firm in the Maritimes, and Canon Kenneth Cameron Hind, an Anglican clergyman. Neither of them had any idea what was waiting for them. 3 days later, on the evening of April 20th, the ship reached the site. Recovery operations began the next morning, April 21st, at 6 in the morning. Captain Frederick Larnder described the scene as hundreds of bodies floating in the open ocean, looking, in his words, like a flock of seagulls because of their white life preservers. On the third day, April 22nd, the crew pulled 119 bodies from the water. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Thomas Armstrong, noted something haunting. With the exception of about 10 bodies that had received serious injuries, their looks were, quote, calm and peaceful. But here's the thing. The Mackay-Bennett had enough embalming supplies for 70 bodies. They recovered 306, so decisions had to be made, and those decisions were made along class lines. First-class passengers were embalmed, placed in coffins, and stored in the rear cable locker. Second-class passengers were embalmed but wrapped in canvas and placed on ice in the forward cable locker. Third-class passengers and crew members were treated differently. Their unembalmed bodies, 116 in total, were returned to the sea in 3 group burial ceremonies. Captain Larnder was blunt about the reasoning. It seemed best, he said, to bring back to land the dead where their deaths might give rise to questions of large insurance, inheritance, and litigation. Sociologist Jess Beer put it more directly. The recovery workers effectively decided which bodies were valued enough to be preserved and which would be allowed to rapidly decompose underwater. It was the class system of the Titanic, extended beyond death. One body they recovered tells us a lot about the stakes involved. On April 22nd, workers pulled body number 124 from the water. He was identified by the initials sewn on the lapel of his jacket. It was John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the Titanic, worth roughly $87 million in 1912, translates to about $2.9 billion today. His personal effects included a gold pocket watch, diamond cufflinks, a diamond ring with 3 stones, over $2,400 in cash, and 225 pounds in English notes. That gold pocket watch sold at auction in 2024 for £1.175 million, the highest price ever paid for a Titanic artifact. When the Mackay-Bennett ran out of embalming fluid, a second ship, the CS Minia, arrived on April 26th with fresh supplies so that bodies could once more be preserved for burial on land. This detail might seem minor, but it underscored something critical. Canadian law at the time required all bodies to be embalmed before being unloaded at any Canadian port, and the Titanic disaster became a massive real-world demonstration of why embalming infrastructure and supply chains mattered on a scale nobody had previously imagined. On April 30th, the Mackay-Bennett returned to Halifax carrying 190 bodies, arriving to the sound of church bells and fire bells ringing across the city. The bodies were brought to the Mayflower curling rink, hastily converted into a temporary morgue. An area was screened off for embalming, and the remaining bodies were placed on specially constructed platforms to aid identification. It was one of the first large-scale uses of a public facility as a mass casualty morgue, a practice that remains standard protocol today. Identification was where the real innovation happened. John Henry Barnstead, working alongside John Snow Jr., developed a systematic documentation process that was groundbreaking for its time. Every body was assigned a number. Physical descriptions were meticulously recorded: height, weight, estimated age, hair color, eye color, birthmarks, scars, tattoos. Personal effects were gathered and placed in small canvas bags corresponding to each body's number. There was no playbook for this in 1912. They wrote the playbook. Those same methods were applied just 5 years later when a French munitions ship exploded in Halifax Harbor, killing nearly 2,000 people. The same curling rink served as the morgue. The same funeral firm, Snow and Company, led the response. The identification protocols that Barnstead and Snow had developed during the Titanic recovery were refined and expanded, and they continued to evolve through the Second World War, eventually feeding into the modern disaster victim identification procedures used by agencies around the world today. Snow had asked for and received help from nearly every undertaker and embalmer in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. That kind of interjurisdictional cooperation among funeral professionals during a mass casualty event was virtually unprecedented. Among the team was Mary Dodosky Walsh, assigned by Snow to embalm all the women and children. And then there's one story from the recovery that deserves its own moment. When the crew of the Mackay-Bennett pulled a small boy from the water, John Snow Jr. later recalled, "He came floating toward us with a little upturned face." No one ever came to claim the child. So the sailors who had recovered him did something remarkable. Using reward money they had received from Vincent Astor for recovering his father's body, they purchased a small white coffin, paid for a proper funeral, and bought a large headstone. On May 4th, 1912, they buried him at Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax, placing a copper pendant in his coffin that read simply, "Our Babe." It was the only burial service held that day. For nearly a century, no one knew who he was. Then, in 2007, DNA analysis by researchers at Lakehead University identified him as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old boy from England traveling with his family in third class. To this day, visitors leave flowers and teddy bears at his grave. It is the most visited site in all of the Titanic cemeteries. In total, 150 bodies were buried across 3 Halifax cemeteries, 121 at Fairview Lawn, 19 at Mount Olivet Catholic Cemetery, and 10 at the Baron de Hirsch Jewish Cemetery. 42 of those buried in Halifax were never identified. 59 bodies were claimed by families and transported elsewhere. The Titanic didn't invent the funeral industry. By 1912, embalming was already established, mortuary schools existed, and professional associations had been operating for 30 years. What the disaster did was stress test the entire system at a scale no one had prepared for. It forced the creation of mass casualty protocols, proved the necessity of systematic identification methods, demonstrated the logistical demands of transporting the dead across borders, and exposed the uncomfortable truth that even in death, not everyone was treated equally. The funeral industry that existed before April 15, 1912, was not the same one that existed after. The Titanic wasn't just a sunken ship, it changed how we care for the dead.